Just gotta wait for YouTube to kick in. I don't know why, but YouTube has been delayed. All right, fantastic. All right, welcome back, everyone. We are doing our usual Sunday presentation. This week's presenter is Christopher Buck, PhD. Christopher Buck publishes broadly as an independent scholar in a wide range of fields, including American Studies, Native American Studies, African American Studies, Religious Studies, Islamic Studies, and Baha'i Studies. Dr. Buck's latest book, Bahá'í Faith, The Basics, is an introduction to this independent world religion that promotes unity among religions, races, and nations. Chris Buck has contributed book chapters to such books as Human Rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran, Winds of Change, The Challenge of Modernity in the Middle East and North Africa, The Bahá'í Faith and African American History. He's published a number of academic journals, articles, and encyclopedia articles as well. He is a former university professor. Buck taught at Pennsylvania State University, Michigan State University, and just a slew of materials and resources. And I'm very grateful that he's here with us again. The topic today is 4 steps for figuring out prophecy. The Bahá'í Faith emphasizes the harmony of science and religion, and therefore, by implication and application, encourages scriptural interpretation that aligns with reason and scientific understanding. When it comes to interpreting scriptural texts, one possible approach is to consider them from 3 levels: historical contemporary, history of interpretation, and Bahá'í-focused interpretation. For example, the parable of the city in the Qur'an offers an example where Abdu'l-Bahá and Bahá'u'lláh provide different yet complementary interpretations of the same passage. The study of religion presents useful insights into the nature of prophecy. As proposed in this presentation, one Bahá'í-inspired approach to interpreting scriptural texts involves a 4-step method that asks questions to determine if the text is literal or figurative, symbolic, and spiritual or social in nature. This is an experimental approach to interpreting these texts and not an authoritative analysis. So I just want to say thank you, Chris, so much for joining us today. And we look forward to this presentation. And all of Chris's accolades and his biography are on the website, so you can find all that information directly on the website. It will also be included in the description in the videos, so check that out. And also come back and look at his other presentations that he's given as well. So Chris, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremiah. And I want to thank the Clearwater Baha'i community for hosting this series of presentations on a wide range of topics. It's impressive, and I'd like to view some more of the presentations myself for my own edification. Okay, today's topic is based on a series
Yeah, you'll need to make sure you're back on the PowerPoint, not the Zoom screen, Chris.
Oh, okay. Before going into this topic, anyone who may be seeing this presentation, and more especially anyone who may be viewing it after the presentation is over online when the PDF is available. These are some Baha'i principles that I discuss in my book, Bahá'í Faith, The Basics, in which I took a look at 2 very fascinating talks that Abdu'l-Bahá gave, one on November 15th, 1912, in the home of Juliet Thompson, where Abdu'l-Bahá was asked, what principles that Baha'u'lláh brought are new. And he was basically asked the same question on December 2nd, 1912. And these two talks, which do not have Persian originals, professional stenographers took the notes, and very capable translators whom I've identified did contemporaneous translations. But when you compare each of these principles to the tablet, Abdu'l-Bahā's first tablet, to the Hague, they are all verified. What I've done is to present these Baha'i principles in a very short form as dynamic Baha'i principles expressed as actions. Jeremiah, would you read these, please?
Search for truth. See humankind as one. See religion as one. Religions should unify. Religion respects science. Women and men are equal. Abolish every prejudice. Promote world peace. Provide education for all. Economic problems require spiritual solutions. The Universal House of Justice is unique. The Baha'i Covenant protects Baha'i unity. Adopt a universal auxiliary language. Work is worship. The Baha'i Faith offers other new principles. Source, Buck, Baha'i Faith, The Basics.
Thank you, Jeremiah. This presentation is based on a series called Figuring Out Prophecies. It's 74 articles. The 75th article was recently edited. I believe it's called Baha'i Principles as Prophecies. So when you search for the series online, Bahá'íTeachings.org is not an official Baha'i website, but I think it has the respect of the institutions. My understanding is that Bahá'íTeachings.org has the widest readership of any existing Baha'i website or Bahá'í-inspired website. So here's the series, and I have links in this presentation to specific articles that I'll be referencing. And in the PDF, you should be able to click on the link and go right to the article. And the few graphics that I have also have links to their original sources. Now, in the introduction that Jeremiah read, basically I'm going to postpone that method as the third method and deal with a couple of other methods first. The second method was also mentioned in the introduction. But the first method is called to interpret prophecies, add the word spiritual. And we'll take a look at that in a couple minutes. The second method is a four-step method. Number one, if impossible, then not literal. Number two, if not literal, then figurative. Number three, if figurative, then symbolic. Number four, if symbolic, then spiritual and social. And in the introduction, Jeremiah talked about the third method as well. Number one, historical contemporary interpretation. Two, the history of interpretation. And three, Baha'i interpretation of prophetic texts. The first method is a basic reorientation in reading well-known prophecies found in the scriptures of world religions. The tendency, as you well know, is for these texts to be read literally, as a quote-unquote faithful reading of the Word of God, as it were. And I grew up with this approach as a Christian, with this approach to reading Scripture generally and prophecy in particular. The second method applies patterns that emerge, at least in my study, of Baha'u'llah's interpretation of prophetic texts. And the third method invokes the Baha'i principle of the harmony of science and religion. So let's take the first approach. To interpret prophecies, add the word spiritual. Now there's the link to that article. It's part 69. To interpret prophecies, add the word spiritual. Click on the link here. And here is a well-known apocalyptic text from the Gospel of Matthew. Jeremiah, would you please read this? These are the words of Jesus as recorded by his disciple Matthew.
Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Should I read the next?
2 more paragraphs.
And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other.
Thank you.
Okay.
So let's read this passage again, adding the word spiritual. And I won't read it again out loud because Jeremiah just did so, but see where I've inserted the word spiritual. And the idea here is that, as Baha'u'llah teaches, and also Abdu'l-Bahá, these prophecies are not to be read literally. They are expressed in figurative language, and they symbolize things to come. Basically, spiritual events which in due course will have visible outcomes in terms of society, in terms of how people view the world, and even impacts on the physical landscape. Now, on the next slide, what we're going to do is we're going to insert Baha'u'llah's interpretations of this prophecy inside square brackets. And the way it goes is this. I think you can see the screen, so I won't tell you when Jesus is talking and when Baha'u'llah is interpreting. You can just follow me in reading this screen, okay? Immediately after the tribulation, the want of capacity to acquire spiritual knowledge and apprehend the word of God of those days shall the sun of the divine beauty be darkened, and the moon of knowledge shall not give her light, and the stars of divine wisdom shall fall, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man, the divine beauty, or Jesus, in the heaven of the will of God. And then all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, that is, meaning veils, with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels, that is, holy beings endowed with the attributes of the spiritual, with the great sound of a trumpet. Here, Baha'u'llah understands this to be the trumpet call of Muhammad's revelation, and they shall gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So this would be, in a sense, highlighting Baha'u'llah's interpretation, which is found in the Book of Certitude of this particular passage from Jesus. Now let's get to the second method, which is 4 steps for figuring out prophecies. And I'm going to give 5 examples. The parts here, right after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are parts in the Figuring Out Prophecy series. And you see the links to those articles as well. So the first example, 4 steps for understanding the mysteries of prophecy. And without maybe thinking about it, whenever someone reads a passage of scripture, especially a prophecy, there's a decision, whether made consciously or unconsciously, as to whether this is to be read literally or figuratively, non-literally. So, for example, if Jesus says, Herod is a fox, that's a pretty clear contextualization where we wouldn't understand that to be literal. We take the attributes of the metaphor fox, such as cunningness, being cunning and tricky, maybe rapacious, in terms of looking for prey, all those things that foxes may represent in one's cultural understanding. Now, there's already a good example of a non-literal interpretation of prophecy in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, where Peter gives a speech in which he quotes or cites from Joel, the prophet Joel. And he's doing so by saying that the prophet Joel's prophecy was fulfilled on the day of Pentecost, which is considered the birth of the Christian church. Jeremiah, would you like to read this, please? Starting with but Peter.
Okay. But Peter, standing up with the 11, raised his voice and said to them, Men of Judea, and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and heed my words. For these are not drunk, as you suppose, since it is only the 3rd hour of the day. But this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. And it shall come to pass in the last days, says God, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall see visions. Your old men shall dream dreams. And on my men servants and on my maid servants I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they shall prophesy. I will show wonders in heaven above, and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood, before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved.
Thank you, Jeremiah. So this is quoted by the Apostle Peter, the disciple Peter, as a proof text that the day of Pentecost fulfills the prophecy of Joel. And Joel is saying that, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and daughters shall prophesy. And when the disciples received the gifts of the Holy Spirit, one of the gifts was the gift of prophecy. So if Peter understands Joel symbolically, so should we. That's a very important passage from Scripture in favor of figurative reading of apocalyptic texts with a symbolic understanding as to their meaning. Okay, now we'll take another text. This is from the book of Revelation, on which Baha'u'lláh offers this commentary. He says, meditate then upon the utterance of the prophets as he intimated to the souls of men through veiled illusions and hidden symbols, the glad tidings of the one who was to come after him, that thou mayest know of a certainty that their words are inscrutable to all, save those who are endued with an understanding heart. He saith, his eyes were as a flame of fire, and brass-like were his feet, and out of his mouth goeth a two-edged sword. And this refers to Revelations 1, verses 14 through 16, chapter 2, verse 18, chapter 19, verse 15. And this is from the notes in the Gems of Divine Mysteries. And here we have the Baha'i Reference Library website, link to this particular passage. We're going to see that Baha'u'lláh argues it's an argument from impossibility. How could these words be literally interpreted? And here's Baha'u'llah's explanation. Would you like to read this, Jeremiah?
Were anyone to appear with all these signs, he would assuredly not be human. And how could any soul seek his company? Nay, should he appear in one city, even the inhabitants of the next would flee from him, nor would any soul dare approach him. Yet shouldest thou reflect upon these statements, thou wouldest find them to be of such surpassing eloquence and clarity as to mark the loftiest heights of utterance and the epitome of wisdom. Methinks it is from them that the sons of eloquence have appeared, and the stars of clarity have dawned forth and shone resplendent. Gems of Divine Mysteries.
Thank you, Jeremiah. And Baha'u'lláh continues, and remember, this is step one. If impossible, then not literal. Baha'u'lláh says, "Behold then the foolish ones of bygone times, and those who in this day await the advent of such a being. Nor would they ever bear allegiance unto him, except that he appear in the aforementioned form. And as such a being will never appear, so too will they never believe. Such indeed is the measure of the understanding of these perverse and ungodly souls. How could those who fail to understand the most evident of the evident and the most manifest of the manifest ever apprehend the abstruse realities of the divine precepts and the essence of the mysteries of his everlasting wisdom?" Okay, now we go to step two. If not literal, then figurative. Do you want to read this explanation from Baha'u'lláh, Jeremiah?
I shall now briefly explain the true meaning of this utterance, that thou mayest discover its hidden mysteries, and be of them that perceive. Examine then, and judge aright that which we shall reveal unto thee, that haply thou mayest be accounted in the sight of God amongst those who are fair-minded in these matters. Know then that he who uttered these words in the realms of glory meant to describe the attributes of the one who is to come in such veiled and enigmatic terms as to elude the understanding of the people of error. Gems of Divine Mysteries.
So here the figurative language, or Baha'u'llah's term for figurative discourse, is veiled and enigmatic terms. Step three, if figurative, then symbolic. Here's Baha'u'llah's symbolic interpretation of these passages from the book of Revelation. Baha'u'lláh says, "Now when he saith, his eyes were as a flame of fire, he alludeth but to the keenness of sight and acuteness of vision of the promised one, who with his eyes burneth away every veil and covering, maketh known the eternal mysteries in the contingent world, and distinguisheth the faces that are obscured with the dust of hell from those that shine with the light of paradise. Were his eyes not made of the blazing fire of God, how could he consume every veil and burn away all that the people possess? How could he behold the signs of God in the kingdom of his names and in the world of creation? How could he see all things with the all-perceiving eye of God?" Again, from Gems of Divine Mysteries. Jeremiah?
Thus have we conferred upon him a penetrating vision in this day. Would that ye believe in the verses of God. For indeed, what fire is fiercer than this flame that shineth in the cyanide of his eyes, whereby he consumeth all that hath veiled the peoples of the world. Immeasurably exalted shall God remain above all that hath been revealed in his unerring tablets concerning the mysteries of the beginning and the end, until that day when the crier will cry out, the day whereon we shall all return unto him. Gems of Divine Mysteries.
Baha'u'lláh continues. This is step 3, if figurative, then symbolic. Baha'u'lláh writes, as to the words, quote, brass-like were his feet, end quote, by this is meant his constancy upon hearing the call of God that commandeth him, quote, be thou steadfast as thou hast been bidden, end quote. He shall so persevere in the cause of God and evince such firmness in the path of his might, that even if all the powers of earth and heaven were to deny him, he would not waver in the proclamation of his cause, nor flee from his command in the promulgation of his laws. Nay, rather, he will stand as firm as the highest mountains and the loftiest peaks. He will remain immovable in his obedience to God and steadfast in revealing his cause and proclaiming his word. Also from the Gems of Divine Mysteries. And indeed, this foreshadows Baha'u'llah's ministry, because remember that Gems of Divine Mysteries was revealed before the Book of Certitude, and the Book of Certitude was revealed in January of 1861. And as you know, Baha'u'lláh declared privately to some of his companions, some of the followers of the Bab, on April 22nd, 1863. And then that declaration became a public proclamation, first, as Baha'u'lláh writes, to mystics, and then divines, and then to rulers. And as some research that Dr. Yuli Ionesian and I did back in 2010, apparently Baha'u'llah's proclamation was also directed to scholars and statesmen. This is in a 2010 article published in Baha'i Studies Review. Baha'u'lláh continues, no obstacle will hinder him, nor will the censure of the froward deter him, or the repudiation of the infidels cause him to waver. And I'm going to skip the rest of this slide, just go to the bottom where he says, glory be to God who hath established him and called him forth. I would view this as an advanced proclamation of Baha'u'llah's mission. Would you like to read this, Jeremiah?
And further he saith, out of his mouth goeth a two-edged sword. Know thou that since the sword is an instrument that divideth and cleaveth asunder, and since there proceedeth from the mouth of the prophets and the chosen ones of God, that which separateth the believer from the infidel, and the lover from the beloved, this term hath been so employed. And apart from this dividing and separating, no other meaning is intended. Thus, when he who is the primal point in the eternal Son desireth, by the leave of God, to gather together all creation, to raise them up from the graves of their own selves, and to divide them one from another, he shall pronounce but one verse from him, and this verse will distinguish truth from error, from this day until the day of resurrection, from Gems of Divine Mysteries.
Thank you, Jeremiah. So here, after Baha'u'lláh establishes that this prophetic text is not literal, based on an argument from impossibility, and after demonstrating that the discourse is figurative, in other words, it's symbolic, in terms of who is being represented by these symbols, here Baha'u'lláh clearly identifies the Bab, referred to here as the primal point. I'm going to skip this passage. It's also similar to the previous one. Step 4, if symbolic, then spiritual and social. Baha'u'lláh writes, "Wert thou to behold all things with the eye of discernment, thou wouldst indeed see that this divine sword doth cleave asunder generations. Would that ye could understand it. All this is by the virtue of the word of separation that is manifested on the day of judgment and separation, were the people to take heed in the days of their Lord. Nay, couldst thou but sharpen thy sight and refine thy heart, thou wouldst witness that all the material swords which in every day and age have slain the infidels and waged war against the impious proceed from this divine and invisible sword. Open then thine eyes, that thou mayest behold all that we have revealed to thee, and attain unto that which none other hath attained." Gems of Divine Mysteries. Jeremiah?
Yea, inasmuch as these people have failed to acquire true knowledge from its source and wellspring, and from the ocean of fresh and soft-flowing waters that stream, by the leave of God, through hearts that are pure and stainless, they have been veiled from that which God hath intended by those words and allusions, and have remained confined within the prison of their own selves. Gems of Divine Mysteries.
Thank you. And then Baha'u'llah's spiritual application continues. "We render thanks unto God for that which he hath bestowed upon us of his grace. He it is who hath caused us to be assured of the truth of his faith, a faith which the combined forces of earth and heaven are powerless to resist. He it is who hath enabled us to acknowledge him," here it's referring to the Bab, "in the day of his presence, to testify unto him whom God shall make manifest in the latter resurrection, and to be among them that have believed in him ere his appearance, that his favor may be made complete unto us and unto all mankind." So here this is just my individual understanding. The latter resurrection refers to Baha'u'lláh. And ere his appearance, before his appearance, means before the appearance of him whom God shall make manifest, which, as you know, or who, as you know, the Bab foretold throughout his scriptures. All right, here's another example. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly so we have more time for discussion. The idea of this PowerPoint is for a takeaway, in other words, a learning resource, because usually when speakers speak, the audience only retains some of what is conveyed, but by having when I was a professor, my students always asked, well, can you send this out on PowerPoint or post this on PowerPoint? And I did, and that enabled them to study the lecture. Okay, we have the same steps here, but here we're going to clarify this process, four-step process, by adding some questions for step 1. So step 1, another way of looking at this is to exclude literal meaning. And the question that we can ask here is, how could these words be literally interpreted? Not meaning how could they be literally interpreted correctly, but how could they be literally interpreted at all? In other words, the argument from impossibility. Step 2, identify figures of speech. As Baha'u'lláh writes, he says, meditate then upon the veiled allusions and hidden symbols, discover its hidden mysteries. Now, these are in the original Arabic, some of these terms actually refer to figures of speech that have been identified in one of the Quranic sciences, which studies rhetoric and the inimitability of the Quran. Step 3, ascertain qualities represented. A question you can ask, describe, or an activity you can do is to describe the attributes of the one who is to come. And step 4, apply to spiritual events. Here we want to recognize the promised one, Baha'u'lláh, in terms of prophecy fulfillment. And this is in relation to Revelations chapter 19, verses 11 through 15, according to Baha'u'llah's interpretation. So another way of asking these questions for step 1, why is the literal reading not possible here? For step 2, what is the comparison or analogy expressed here? Question for step 3, what qualities does this symbol represent? Step 4, who or what represents these qualities? And you apply this question to historical persons and or events. So let's take another prophecy. This is from the Quran this time, instead of from Matthew and the book of Revelation. Those are the 2 previous examples we looked at. Would you like to read this passage, Jeremiah?
And now comprehend the meaning of this verse. The whole earth shall on the resurrection day be but his handful, and in his right hand shall the heavens be folded together. Praise be to him. And high be he uplifted above the partners, they join with him. Quran 39:67.
Thank you. So for step 1, if impossible, then not literal. This is Baha'u'llah's impossibility argument. Baha'u'llah writes, and now I'll be fair in thy judgment. Were this verse to have the meaning which men suppose it to have, of what profit, one may ask, could it be to man? Moreover, it is evident and manifest that no such hand as could be seen by human eye could accomplish such deeds, or could possibly be ascribed to the exalted essence of the one true God. Nay, to acknowledge such a thing is not but sheer blasphemy, an utter perversion of the truth. And should it be supposed that by this verse are meant the manifestations of God, who will be called upon on the day of judgment to perform such deeds, this too seemeth far from the truth and is surely of no profit. So, besides the argument from impossibility, Baha'u'llah has a second argument. What good would this do? What purpose would this serve? Of what profit would it be? It's a very interesting analysis. So I'm just highlighting this statement by Baha'u'llah. Moreover, it is evident and manifest that no such hand as could be seen by human eye could accomplish such deeds. You know, in classical Islam, there was a debate over whether God had a hand or not, because the Quran says, the God has, 2 hands, as I recall. So the Quran is a revelation from God. The Quran is true. So if the Quran says that God has hands, we should believe it, right? And there was another side, rational, what we might call anti-anthropomorphists. They would say, well, this is figurative, it's symbolic. God is not human. By the term hand, means power, God's ability, expressed as a metaphor. So, there would be debates in Islam over passages in the Quran such as this. All right, step 2, if not literal, then figurative. This is where Baha'u'llah talks about the nature of this kind of prophetic discourse. Jeremiah?
Know verily that the purpose underlying all these symbolic terms and abstruse allusions which emanate from the revealers of God's holy cause hath been to test and prove the peoples of the world, that thereby the earth of the pure and illumined hearts may be known from the perishable and barren soil. From time immemorial such hath been the way of God amidst his creatures, and to this testify the records of the sacred books, the Kitabi.
Thank you. Well, here's where Baha'u'lláh begins to interpret after ruling out a literal interpretation. Baha'u'lláh writes, on the contrary, by the term earth is meant the earth of understanding and knowledge, and by heavens, the heavens of divine revelation. Reflect thou in how in one hand he hath by his mighty grasp turned the earth of knowledge and understanding previously unfolded into a mere handful, and on the other spread out a new and highly exalted earth in the hearts of men, thus causing the freshest and loveliest blossoms and the mightiest and loftiest of trees to spring forth in the illumined bosom of man. This is also from the Book of Certitude. This describes a symbolic universe, a spiritual realm that can only be expressed by way of metaphors. It's a beautiful interpretation. I'm going to skip over this slide. You can look at the PowerPoint later on. And I'm going to go to the third method in the interest of time, except just to highlight one of the arguments of Baha'u'lláh. Would you like to read this, Jeremiah?
Judge fairly. Were the prophecies recorded in the gospel to be literally fulfilled, were Jesus, son of Mary, accompanied by angels to descend from the visible heaven upon the clouds, who would dare to disbelieve? Who would dare to reject the truth and wax disdainful? Nay, such consternation would immediately seize all the dwellers of the earth, that no soul would feel able to utter a word, much less to reject or accept the truth. The Kitabi.
Thank you. Okay, here's the third method, 3 steps for figuring out prophecies, 5 examples. We'll just take a look at a couple of them. And here are the references to the articles in the Figuring Out Prophecy series. And here I want to invoke at this point in the presentation, Shoghi Effendi's statement that the Baha'i Faith is scientific in its method. What does this mean, and how does it apply to the interpretation of prophecies? In 1933, June 1933, Shoghi Effendi wrote a letter to the High Commissioner for Palestine. I believe that Shoghi Effendi was asked to describe what the Baha'i Faith was, what its purpose was for, and so on. And so at the opening, Baha'u'lláh writes, Shoghi Effendi writes, quote, the revelation proclaimed by Baha'u'lláh, his followers believe, is divine in origin, all-embracing in scope, broad in its outlook, scientific in its method, humanitarian in its principles, and dynamic in the influence it exerts on the hearts and minds of men. Now, this idea that the Baha'i Faith is scientific in its method probably, in my understanding, refers to the well-known Baha'i principle of the harmony of science and religion. And in that slide I showed earlier of the dynamic Baha'i principles expressed as actions, in short form, this could principle could be understood as religion respects science. And this is just a more intensified form of the idea of faith and reason, which people in religions have talked about for a long time. Now, there's not exactly a scientific study of religion, but a term that comes close. And it's a German term that means the science of religion. In the West, we talk about it as the academic study of religion. And before that, it used to be termed religious studies. And that was abandoned because religious studies is a vague term because it can be construed to mean religious studies from the standpoint of religion or as an academic discipline. So the study of religion is preferred. When I was doing my PhD in religious studies at the University of Toronto, I did it at the Center for Religious Studies in 1991. And then I think it was in 1992 or 1993, the Center for Religious Studies, the name got changed to the Center for the Study of Religion. Now, let's take the famous Yuletide prophecy of Isaiah 9:6 and show how this method works. And the method, again, is to, number one, take a look at the historical contemporary interpretation. What that means, when scholars say that, it means, well, how did the audience at that particular time who first read the prophecies, how did that audience understand these texts? So that's what historical and contemporary interpretation is. Number two, step two, the history of interpretation. Well, let me give an example of a book that I read many years ago that I still like a lot. It's called The History of Messianic Speculation in Israel by Abba Hillel Silver. And when you read this book, one of the things that, as a Baha'i, struck me was that the rabbis who interpreted when the Messiah would come, they gave differing dates, but their method was very similar. They took prophetic years as prophetic days, and prophecy as years. And so, the method by which they calculated the appearance of the date of the Messiah is very similar to the method that Abdu'l-Bahá adopts in Some Answered Questions. And then the third step is Bahá'í interpretation. When we present these three steps, we show our audience that, number one, we have done our homework. We're applying, some of the principles of the harmony of science and religion as have been applied in the academic study of religion. We acknowledge that other interpretations exist, and we demonstrate that knowledge by highlighting a few examples. And then we offer a Baha'i interpretation, understanding all the while that the method of what's called presentism has applied at each step of the way. In other words, people don't really care what the prophecy meant originally. They just care if it applies to their day and age. And that's how prophecies tend to be interpreted throughout history. So this article, Baha'u'lláh and Isaiah's triple prophecy, means that one prophecy has three different types of fulfillment. You want to read this, Jeremiah?
This is the Father foretold by Isaiah, and the Comforter concerning whom the Spirit had covenanted with you. Open your eyes, O concourse of bishops, that ye may behold your Lord seated upon the throne of might and glory.
Thank you. Now, Jewish interpreters, not all of them, but the tendency is for them to understand Isaiah 9:6 for unto us as a child is born. We'll read Professor T.K. Shane's translation in a minute. He was an Old Testament scholar who became a Baha'i. They understand this to be Hezekiah, or alternatively to God. So this would be a contemporary or a historical contemporary interpretation. In the history of interpretation, Christians, of course, applied this to Jesus. In the Baha'i interpretation, Baha'is understand this to be Baha'u'lláh. All three may happily coexist. In other words, we can represent that this is how the prophecy, Isaiah's prophecy, has been understood throughout religious history. Now here's the Reverend T.K. Shane, who became a Baha'i, and his last book is called The Reconciliation of Races and Religions. You can get a Kindle edition of this for free, from Amazon if you want. And would you like to read this statement from Abdu'l-Bahá to this scholar, Jeremiah?
O thou, my spiritual philosopher, it is likewise my hope that in the future the East and the West may become conscious that thou wert a divine philosopher and a herald to the kingdom.
Thank you. Now, here is Professor Chain's translation of Isaiah 9:6. For a child is born unto us, a son is given unto us, and the government resteth upon his back, and his name is called Wonder Counselor, God Mighty One, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Increased is the government, and to peace there is no end. And this is from his book, The Prophecies of Isaiah, a new translation with commentary and appendices. This guy was a major scholar of the Old Testament. His publications are impressive. For him to have represented, believed in the Bahá'í Faith is quite an event. In fact, according to Joanna Hawke, who wrote the biographical article on T.K. Chain that was published in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography in 2004, she calls Thomas Kelly Chain the most eminent Western academic to become a Baha'i during Abdu'l-Bahā's ministry. So again, we're going to look at this prophecy as number one, referring to Hezekiah, next referring to Jesus Christ, and then to Baha'u'lláh. We have the same approach from chapter 20 in the book of Revelation. And the idea in this particular article is that the book of Revelation is a cosmic event, a dramatic scenario that is replayed and reenacted in each religious dispensation. Now, there's a scholar that I quote in this article that has some interesting statements to make about the book of Revelation. He says a common and helpful metaphor to guide interpretation of a text is to reflect on the three worlds implicit in every text. There is the world within the text, the world behind the text, and the world in front of the text. So when he talks about the world within the text, here's what he has to say. Of course, the one most apparent to us is the world contained within the text, a world of lambs and dragons, beautiful women and beasts, heavenly messengers and human observers. So there is a dragon in the text, but there were no dragons in the world of the audience. 2, to understand the dragon in the text, we need to explore the world behind the text, the historical and social world that generated these images, characters, and actions. Now, without question, this world in front of the text can distort our reading. And then he has an interesting, the scholar's name is David Bard, an interesting comment on the Left Behind series and Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth. He says, we have a whole series of best-selling novels called the Left Behind series, imagining what will happen on the earth after the, quote, rapture. This apparently makes good sense to people, even though Revelation makes no mention of any rapture. And in fact, the notion was invented only in the 19th century. But because it has become such a part of our world in front of the text, people see it in the text. In the same way, most of my students are so immersed in readings like Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth that they think that is what the story says. But of course, it is not. While claiming to be a literal reading, this modern interpretation engages in the most outlandish allegorization of the text. The beast is Russia or China. The 10 kings are the European Union. Babylon was, according to Lindsey, a code for a one-world religion. And there's the reference. Well, we see some other examples in this presentation, but I'm going to end it here and just, I'll tell you, I'm going to make a couple changes, and then I'll send the updated PDF to Jeremiah, and he can post online. Thank you, Jeremiah, for hosting this event. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Chris, for this wonderful and very thorough presentation. It's going to require several reviews of going back and forth for me personally. So, but I appreciate it. Thank you. So now would be the time for anyone in the Zoom to actually, you can send questions into the chat, or you can just raise your hand, or just unmute yourself and ask a question directly of Chris. We can also take questions from the social media. So if anyone has any questions on Facebook or YouTube, go ahead and post them, and I'll check them here in a little bit. You've left everyone speechless.
Okay, well, we'll post it online, and hopefully this will be a useful resource for some of our friends.
Would you be able to highlight? So the majority of the references that you were linking, these articles, these are on Bahá'íTeachings.org.
Yes,
Is where you have them, and so you've been able to compile them essentially into these PowerPoints. Is that what you've done with them?
that's right. And then the sources that they quote are also in the articles.
Oh, wonderful. So, if there's, if there's not any other questions, then I guess we could probably wrap up. I have some notes just for. What's the expression? I have some details for the rest of the week that I'm going to highlight happening. But before we do that, Chris, I'd like to know, do you have any other more presentations that similar to this that you've done that we can reference, or other than the articles, or is this the first one that you've done for this?
Well, most of the other articles are academic. So, for example, in 2004, the paper I presented at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in December 2000 is called The Eschatology of Globalization, Baha'u'llah's Multiple Messiahship Revisited. So a number of these principles are contained in that. That was published by E.J. Brill. The most popular social media platform for academics and independent scholars is called academia.edu. So I have a web page there, and many of my academic publications are available there. Of course, my first book was on Baha'u'llah's Book of Certitude. It's called Symbol and Secret, Qur'án Commentary and Baha'u'llah's Kitab-i-Iqan. And a number of other places in which I discuss apocalyptic discourse and so on and so forth. This is in a sense a popularization of, what I do on Baha'íTeachings.org is I take much of what I've learned as a scholar and apply it to contemporary discourse.
So one last question, so do you have a website that has all of these materials and resources compiled in one location and linked, or is it just all over the place? So we'll just take the references that you've cited here, and then maybe any additional ones that you can send to me that we could add in the links in the descriptions.
Can you see Chrome on my screen?
No, we only see the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you would have to stop the screen share and then start it again if you wanted to.
Let me do that. Okay, can you see Chrome here?
Yes, we see it.
All right. So the website that I just mentioned, the social media platform called academia.edu here's my web page. And it's divided into different kinds of classifications like books. So here's a link to Bahá'í Faith, the Basics, for example. This is a presentation. These are 29 book chapters. The Baha'i People of the Eye metaphor. Elaine Locke's Philosophy of Democracy. Discovering the Quran, Daganawida the Peacemaker, Edward Granville Brown. Abdu'l-Bahá's 1912 Howard University speech. Those are examples of book chapters. 28 Baha'i Studies articles. My latest being Baha'i Prayers for Good Governance. Scholar Meets Prophet, Edward Granville Brown and Baha'u'lláh. Article on Baha'is in the Encyclopedia of the Quran, and so forth. There are 50 Baha'i Principles of Unity, a Paradigm of Social Salvation, etc. And then there's more, 25 African American Studies articles, some Native American Studies articles, and so forth. So this would be the most complete single place you can find the work I've done.
Wonderful. So friends, we have lots of material that we can go through. I thank you so much, Chris. Let's go ahead and just conclude for the day. I know it's a little bit later in the afternoon than what we're used to, so I just want to thank everyone in the Zoom who made it. If you have any questions after this, by all means, forward them to admin@clearwaterbahais.org, and I'll be sure to get those to Chris, and then I'm sure he'll reach back out to you directly or back out through us here at Clearwater Bahais. The other thing is, coming up in the week, we have presentations throughout the week. We have one on Monday, a roadmap for a moral society, which starts at 7 p.m. We have a co-presentation type project where Wade Franson sends his live stream from YouTube to our channel as well. So you can catch that on Tuesday nights at 9 p.m. And then on Wednesday, we have Peter Terry discussing the Kitabi Gan. And then, of course, next Sunday, we'll have another presentation. We have one question from Riaz. So Riaz.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, dear Dr. Buck, on the website, PSU-US, does it refer to Pennsylvania State University?
Yeah, the reason, Riaz, is because the last course I taught was at the great Penn State Greater Allegheny campus. It was Introduction to Criminal Law. So I just used my last and latest affiliation for this website, even though I have been a faculty instructor for the Wilmette Institute for, over 20 years.
Okay, wonderful. PSU, Penn State University. All right, good. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll include this link in all the documentation. So everyone listening or watching, just the simplest place to find all the necessary links and information is going to be at www.clearwaterbahais.org, and scroll down to the bottom, and you should be able to see the link for this this presentation. So again, thank you so much, Christopher Buck. I really appreciate it. I know our community appreciates it, and I know everyone else listening and watching this appreciates it. So thank you so much, and we hope to have you back here soon.
Thank you, Jeremiah.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.